Ganya too, just to make sure no one is.
All righty. Now, how do we know when somebody joins in late?
You'll see a notification up here. It'll pop up and
On
say,
the black
yeah,
band? All
yeah.
right. Okay, well, hello, everybody who's not here. This is an experimental program, and we have no idea if anybody is going to join in. But I'm going to go ahead and give the program, assuming that somebody will join in or listen to us online through the YouTube from the Box of Books here in Alfred, New York. This is a program that we are calling Grow Your Own, and it's almost all about your vegetable garden, new or old. And I was going to spend the first couple of minutes introducing everybody who is not here, so we'll skip that part. This is the first in a series of 15 sessions every other Friday at 11:30 to 12:30, and we'll go through October. Now, what I'm going to try and do is follow the gardening year. And so in April, we'll talk about things that you'll be doing in the early springtime, all the way through the end of October when we're putting the gardening to bed. My topics are going to be very brief. It's like trying to cram a million things into a half hour. Can't do it. But that means you, the listener, the participant, is going to have to do some homework. You'll take the ideas that you get from here, and you'll either go to a library and get out a book or go online to find more information about what we discussed. And when you go online, you have to be careful where you find your information, because as we all know, everybody has opinions, and a lot of those opinions are just that, not based on fact. But if you want a more true bit of information, then you should go to some website that ends in .edu, like Cornell University. They're a land grant university here in New York State that originally was founded for agriculture, and they still have a very strong program. And they have done probably over 100 years of research, testing, recording results, and coming up with what is probably a true answer. So if you're interested in keeping the bunnies and the deer out of your garden, don't go to the Buffalo Zoo and buy their sack of lion dung. I'm not sure the Buffalo Zoo does this, but some do. And bring it home to sprinkle it around your garden to keep out the bunnies and the deer, because it won't work. All right, so go to a source that's based on scientific research. As I said, we are going to have 15 sessions through October. It'll be an hour long, roughly divided into 2 halves. I want to have an open mic so that people can ask pertinent questions. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole on off-topic subject matter, because then things will never get done properly. If you have more questions at 12:30 when the program's over, you can stay for a few minutes more and ask, and we'll try and get those solved. Although I am not an expert, I don't know everything, but I know a lot. So we'll see where we can get on that. We're going to have an open mic, which means it's like a classroom setting. We're all going to, a dozen or so of us, are going to sit around as if we were in a classroom. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, just kind of wave your hand. And Melanie, who can't be here today because she's the only one in the library, has to take care of the library customers. But normally she or Remo will be here. And we'll spot your waving hand and you can ask your question. Also, I asked Melanie, how long is this recorded program kept, wherever it's kept in the cloud? wherever. And she said, forever. So I said, oh, my great-grandchildren can watch it. She said, yep, well, maybe. So if you want to rewatch it, go on the YouTube page, is that what it's called? For the Alfred Buxton Books Library, and you can find out how to connect and watch it whenever. Alrighty. Often when I start with a new program, I like to tell a tale from ancient China. And this tale is about a young man coming of age, a thoughtful young man. And he spent a lot of his teenage years and early adulthood wondering about one of the big questions in life. And one of them was, how can I be happy? He wanted to be happy. And several people in his village said, well, you know, there's this old man. Some called him a shaman. And he has spent his whole life living up on that mountain in his little hut, thinking about things. That's what he does. He thinks. He probably would have an answer. So the young man, early in the morning, sets out. It's kind of an arduous climb. But by late afternoon, he gets to the top where there's the hut and there's the old man sitting in front of his hut, staring off across the valley to the far mountains. So the young man approaches and stands there and waits and waits. And finally, the old man looks up, raises his eyebrows, gestures for the young fellow to sit, and says, what is it you want? And the young man eagerly says, I have one question.
You're giving like these
How can I be happy?
perspectives, yeah.
The old man kind of nods, looks off across the mountain again. And then he says, well, if you'd be happy for a day, then go to the market in the morning, purchase a pig, bring it home, have it butchered, have it barbecued, invite all your friends for the evening and have a party, and you'll be happy for a day.
Oh, yeah.
The young man sat there and
So
thought,
how do you find the books?
Well,
Just like.
that is an answer, but it wasn't really the answer I was looking for, he thinks. But after a bit, the old man says, but have you noticed life answers are always filled with a but or however? But if you'd be happy for a year, get married. Oh, thought the young man. Married a year. And then after an even longer pause, the old man says, but if you'd be happy forever, grow a garden.
Yeah, I don't.
I have always, when I first read that, I don't know, years ago, I thought, what a wonderful story. Grow a garden and be happy forever. And I think anybody that gets caught up in gardening, whether at a very young age or much older in life, it's one of those areas that no matter how long you live and how long you garden, you will never learn it all. There'll be a turn of the page, and there is something that you never knew before. And so a garden is an unending process. That was Melanie, if you saw her, just peeking in to see if anybody else was there. All righty. So after that great story as a starter, we're going to talk about two things today. One is, if you're a new gardener, where do you put your vegetable patch? And if you are already a gardener that's stuck with your patch, wherever it is, what can you do to make it better? So we're going to talk about 4 things to consider. And the first is the amount of sunshine. Almost all the vegetables we grow and eat need at least minimum 6 hours a day of sunshine. The more the better. Some things will grow in 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day, but most like more than that. Now, and if you have a choice between you're either going to have morning sun or afternoon sun, choose the morning sun. It dries off the dew. You're going to have less disease problems for drier plants during the day. Most of you realize this, that the peak day length is towards the end of June at the summer solstice, when for us here in Allegheny County, we have about 15 hours between sunrise and sunset. And the sun at noon is about 70 degrees above the southern horizon. So not only are the days long, but the sun is more intense. It's brighter and it feels hotter. It's providing more energy. However, let's say you're choosing a new spot and there's a big chunk of lawn, and at the southern end of that is a row, fairly high row of shrubs, let's say forsythia. And you will notice if it's in June or early July, that those shrubs will cast a bit of a shadow into the edge of your quote new garden. But shadows don't stay still just because the sun doesn't stay still. And every day after June 21st, it'll be less and less and less high in the sky, which means the shadow will start creeping north into your garden. Such by September, it'll be quite a bit longer than it was in June. So you got to keep things like that in mind if it's a new garden site. All right, the second thing is drainage. And as we all know in Allegheny County, we tend to have poor soil, meaning shallow and poorly drained, partly because the subsoil is compacted and has a lot of clay in it that doesn't allow for the moisture to seep through. And this we can blame on the glacier that didn't leave here 10,000 years ago, I think, roughly. And at one time it was 1.5 miles high, 8,000 feet up, pressing down, 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 down. And it also scraped away a lot of our original topsoil, left a lot of rocky rubble, shallow soil behind. So we won't talk about it today. What this means for us, we should probably have raised beds of one sort or another, and this will help with the drainage. The third thing to consider is the wind. Now, I just heard on the news that in the last 20 years, since 2000, the number of extreme wind events in Western New York has doubled. And since I live up on a hillside with some open fields off to the southwest, I'm very aware of this. Many more days and nights where the wind is 45, 50, 55 miles an hour. And that didn't happen that often years ago. So what do? Gardens, like butterflies, do not like a lot of wind. So if your garden is exposed to those winds, which, by the way, in summer tend to come out of the southwest and the west, you need to provide some kind of windbreak. Now, if you're planning to live there for 10, 20, 30 years, you probably want to plant a and you have enough space, plant a windbreak of evergreen trees. But they take 10, 15, 20 years to get big enough to really be effective. So what you need is either temporarily or permanently a fence. Okay, 3 things about fences. Well, 4 things. You obviously put them on the windward side. So that'd be to the west, southwest. Preferably use materials that don't rot away after a few years. Most wood will rot away. If you have to use or want to use wood, larch or locust, 10, 15 years before it begins to rot, would be your choice. Excuse me. The second thing is you do not want to raise a solid barrier. That will stop the wind, push it up, cascade it over, and tumble it around, turbulence, which the plants don't like either. So what you want is a slotted gap. Picket fence, think picket fence or a louvered fence. So my picket fence, the wooden pickets are, I don't know, about 3 inches wide with an inch gap, 3 inches, an inch gap. So 3 pickets per foot. And that allows, or louvered fences, maybe the planks are more like 4 to 6 inches wide with maybe 2-inch gap. This slows the wind down and allows it to pass through without a lot of turbulence. So how high? Let's say you decide on a 3-foot high, that's above ground, 3-foot high fence, picket fence. That will protect downwind towards the east 10 times the distance. So 3 feet, 30 feet. If you have a 40-foot garden in mind, a 4-foot fence. Okay, so that's it on fences. And the last thing, which most of us can't achieve easily, maybe, by the way, if you haven't already bought land, if you're a real new gardener where you've moved into the area and you're looking for a place to either buy a home or build one, choose a south slope because, okay guys, 6th grade math, for every 1 degree that the land slopes to the south, that means if your garden is 100 feet long from north down to the south, the upper end, the north end, is going to be 1 foot higher than the southern end. Or if it's a 50-foot long garden, 6 inches lower. Now that doesn't seem like much, does it? What difference does 1 degree slope to the south make? You'd be surprised. What you're doing is taking your garden and for every 1 degree, moving it 70 degrees to the south. 70 degrees? No, 70 miles. Sorry, 70 miles to the south. Now this means that springtime is going to come 4 days on the average earlier every year. And your soil is going to warm up and dry out a little bit earlier, which means those early crops like peas can go in 3 or 4 days earlier than normal. So we'll talk about that in more detail at some other time. Okay, so that's not all that you have to deal with on choosing the site, but those are the main things: the amount of sun, how damp, wet the ground is going to be, not just temporarily in the spring when the snow melts or after a heavy thunderstorm in the summer, but in general. Veggie gardens don't grow in swamps, so how damp it is important. And finally, the wind and the slope. Okay, that was part 1. And I squint here for the time. Okay. Now the second part is going to be about planting early. And I'm going to throw out a challenge today or whenever you listen to this. Ask 10 people at random, what should I put in my garden? And almost always the answer will be, oh, we don't put the garden in until Memorial Day. I heard that 35 years ago when I moved back here. And I heard it the other day on the radio by somebody who ought to have known better. Memorial Day, that's when you put your garden in. Well, here's what I say to that. We're myth busting today. If you only grow tomatoes, corn, pumpkins, peppers, watermelon, maybe green beans, fine, wait till Memorial Day. Those are all tender crops that do not like Jack Frost and will do well if you plant them on Memorial Day or later even. However, all our cool weather crops, you have just thrown away 6 weeks from mid-April of the growing season. So what do I mean by cool weather or warm weather crops? If you take all your vegetables, you can break them down into 4 main categories. One are the hardy vegetables. What would I call hardy? Peas, spinach, radishes, Brussels sprouts, maybe kale. Those veggies don't mind Jack Frost coming to visit. They're up and growing. Along comes the cold snap, drops down to 25. They're fine. As a matter of fact, they grow best when the soil is still relatively cool and the air temperature is relatively cool. That's what they thrive in. And not only do they thrive in those early spring days from mid-April on into early June, but when you harvest them in May and June, when at least in the old days, we'll talk about that towards the end, the weather in the old days, they taste so much better because they matured in relatively cool temperatures. Okay, so those are the hardy crops. Then we have something called half hardy. They survive 28, 30 degrees. So once again, they should go in by the 3rd week in April, usually. So what are they? Let's see. Lettuce transplants, broccoli transplants, onion transplants. We'll talk about why we transplant onions some other time, maybe next time. Lettuce seeds, carrot seeds, beet seeds. What did I forget? Oh, and potatoes. Now, of those half hardy, potatoes are the ones that are a little on the border between half hardy and tender. But here's how I'm just going to take a brief side trip here, how to plant potatoes. There are lots of different ways to plant potatoes. The traditional American way, the way the Irish did under the seaweed, and the queen of mulch, I'm forgetting her name right now, but it will come back to me, who back in the 50s and 60s came up with the idea of totally mulching your garden and never digging it up and planting everything in the mulch. Well, I've tried all 3, and the one that works best for me is that I plant my potato sets 2 inches under the soil. That's to keep the mice from nibbling on them if I just laid them on the ground and mulched them. And then I cover them, this is like the 3rd week in April, with about 2 inches of mowed up leaves. Now it will take those potato sets whose eyes have already begun to poke out, probably 3 weeks to come above the leaf line. And by then you're in the middle of May, which is the average last frost. So you keep an eye on the weather report. And if it's going to drop to 32 or lower, take a sheet, doubled up, and drop it on top of your tiny little potatoes, and they'll be just fine also. So those are the first two that need to get in the month of April, somewhere from early, middle April to later April. Then you have your tender crops that I talked about, your green beans, your corn, your tomatoes, zucchini, pumpkins. I don't put them out till the middle of May, which once again, you have to have some boxes handy because maybe the tomatoes will need covering up on a cool night. But usually I'm successful by putting them out in the middle of May. And then come your tender plants who forget 32 and Jack Frost. If it gets down to 40, they do not like that. And they'll pout and they'll just sit there and sulk. Like a teenager. We all know what that's like. Okay. What are those? Well, eggplants, peppers, lima beans, winter squash, butternut squash, oddly enough, and watermelons. I think those are the main things I grow that really need warm soil and warm air. So they don't go out until usually the end of May, 1st of June. And then I keep those boxes and old sheets handy because once again, the weather in spring in the southern tier, Allegheny County, is very irregular. It always was, and it's even more so now with our new normal. So let me just briefly talk about the new normal. Wherever I go, whether it's casual conversation with family and friends or an actual talk somewhere, you have somebody's hand go up. But I had snow in the middle of June or whatever. Let's clarify. Let's define four things. Weather. The weather is what happens when you get up in the morning and you look out the window and whatever it's doing that day is the weather for that day. And as we know, around here in the springtime, March, April, even into May, what the daily weather is doing bounces around a lot. It doesn't seem to be very consistent. However, climate is something different. Climate is the average of your daily weather recorded over a year, 10 years, and averaged together to come up with your regional climate, whether that be the whole Northeast, New York State, or the Southern Tier, or even Allegheny County. And depending on where you live in Allegheny County, usually altitude, how high above sea level you are, will affect your local climate. So that's the difference between weather and climate. But there's something else now. What's the climate based on? Well, the American Weather Service keeps records. They've done this ever since just after the Civil War. So if you actually wanted to know what the weather was like in Belmont back in 1836 on a Wednesday in October, somewhere, if you could find it, you'd have that record. Pretty interesting. Okay, so what they do is up until the beginning of 2020, our weather had been based upon a 30-year average that started in 1980, in 1980 through the 80s, through the 90s, and up to 2010. It's a 30-year record which produced the daily weather reports into an average for the climate, for a climate. And that was the normal. So what happened from 2010 up to 2020? Well, they waited, and when they got to 2020, they kicked out the 80s and they added the teens. So now our climate is based on the weather from 1990 to 2020. We have a new normal. And what is that new normal? Well, when I lived here years ago and when I moved back 35 or so years ago, we lived here in Allegheny County, more or less in zone 4B, which meant that 2 or 3 times in the winter, the temperature would drop to 25 below. I remember those days. And of course, we had lots of snow from Election Day in early November through March, with hardly any bare ground showing. And in the springtime, our average last frost wasn't until May 21st, close to Memorial Day. And then if you waited into the fall, it was September 21st, first frost on average. So that gave us 4 months, 120 days of average frost-free to grow our gardens. The new normal has shifted those frost dates. In the spring, 10 days back to May 10th, and in the fall, 10 days forward to October 1st, giving us about 3 extra weeks in between of frost-free time. And not only that is we no longer, except rarely, get a temperature below 20 below, which shifted us up out of the 4B into the 5A zone. And this, of course, is all due to global warming. So anyway, on the one hand, you'd think, wow, I got 3 extra weeks. I really can grow those watermelon. I can really get some peppers or muskmelons. But the downside is, with that increase in temperature and extension of our frost-free time, has come what we now know as erratic weather. And I think it was 4 or maybe 5 springs ago, when in the month of March, we had 4 days, I think it was, when the thermometer reached 80. But then again, crash. Sometime in April or late May, we had a super hard freeze. I think that was the year that the upper Midwest, Michigan, they lost most of their apple crop because of what happens in erratic weather, super warm early on in March or early April. And the flower buds are tricked into thinking, oh, nice and warm, time to swell, time to open. Ta-da, where are the bees? Because the bees aren't always in sync anymore. It's down in the ground, it's still cold. Anyway, blossoms bloomed, and then along came that hard freeze, and they all got killed. No apple blossoms, no apples. So on the one hand, you might think gardening has gotten easier because it's warmer earlier and warmer later. But with that comes this up and down yo-yo type weather, which I think makes gardening much harder. But anyway, that basically is my talk for the day. We're about 15 minutes short of the hour, but nobody's joined in, at least for now. So I'm going to end it here. And in 2 weeks, on April 22nd, we'll talk about how to start a small garden, I believe that, especially for newcomers, go small and be successful, because you'll have the time and the energy to do it right. And by small, I mean 10 feet by 10 feet, 10 squared, 100 square feet, 2 king size beds, not very big, but you can grow at least $700 worth of veggies in that small space throughout the spring, summer, and into the fall. And it doesn't have to be 10 by 10. It can be, because that would mean you need a path in the middle, because who can reach 5 feet? And the whole idea of raised beds is once you make them, you don't walk on them, right? So the other idea is 25 by 4. That's also 100. Or if you don't want it 25 feet long, a bed that's 12 by 4 and another one that's 13 by 4. And that will give you your 100 square feet. And you won't have to walk on it because you can reach in 2 feet. Okay, so we'll talk about either converting your present day garden into a raised bed situation, or if you are planning to start a new garden and it's way too wet to do any digging, you'll only make cement blocks. So how do you start a garden in the spring when it's too wet? And we'll talk about how all your garden preparation should be done in the fall, in October, when usually the ground is drier and workable. And you can add all your amendments and get it all ready to go, so that come spring next year, it'll be there and be ready. You won't have to worry about wet soil. So that's all next time. And for now, right now on this Friday, it's sort of cleared off. It's quite cool. There's expecting a few snow showers maybe tonight or Saturday night, but the peepers are peeping. The bluebirds are checking out the houses, their houses, not mine. And definitely spring is here. All right, till next time. Melanie? Yeah. You can turn it off. Okay. What time is it? Oh, okay, it's early, but you see nobody was there to ask questions. so-
No.
Okay. Well, that's just wonderful. Oh, let's see.